Hey there, and welcome to chapter 3 on bold and vibrant coloring. You can see I'm celebrating a little bit of bold, vibrant colors myself. We're going to show you how to get the most out of colors in Photoshop. So there are a lot of tools that we can take advantage of in Lightroom, but if you're in Photoshop, we can take things just a little bit further. We'll have a little bit more control over our colors in general. So without any further ado, let's jump into Photoshop. So here we are, and you can see I'm going to take our sample image from our download and simply drag that to Photoshop. So it's bold and vibrant 3.jpg. Let's hit F for full screen. Now, before we get in and start using Photoshop specific tools, I do want to introduce you to Adobe Camera Raw, which basically gives you the same tools that you use in Lightroom. So if you liked some of the stuff from last chapter, or you're just a Lightroom user in general, and you want access to those tools in Photoshop, it's really easy to get to those. Now, if you open up a RAW file natively in Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw automatically pops up. But if you open a JPEG, you don't see Adobe Camera Raw. So you'd want to take some, basically you just got to activate it. It's under the filter. So let's go ahead and show you how to do it. My first suggestion, whenever you're going to use any filter in Photoshop, is convert your layer into a smart object. That way you can undo that filter later if you want to. So we're going to right click here and we're going to go to convert to smart object, just on my background layer here. Okay, and here we can see this little icon right here lets us know we have a smart object. So now that it's a smart object, we're going to go to filter and we're going to go to camera raw filter. There we go. And basically this is the exact same sliders that we would get if we were in Lightroom. So you can see adjusting your exposure from our last sections. We saw like vibrance and things like that. You could even go in here and work on your details, and you have access to a tone curve that looks the same like it does in Lightroom as well. So just wanted to go through and show you all of these different tools that, show you that you can get to them in Photoshop. For some people, I think it's just a little bit more intuitive just to like change all these settings here. But let's just make a couple of quick changes. We'll just bring our exposure down just a little bit, bring our contrast up a little bit, bring our highlights up a little bit. So a couple little quick changes, and go ahead and hit OK. So you can see it applies that to my image. And right here where I have this smart filters, I've got an eye here and then an eye drop here. So, or eyeball here. This eye right here on the bottom will just turn this filter off and on. There we go. And the eye next to the smart filters, that'll turn all of the filters off and on. So we'll just go to filter and then blur and over to Gaussian blur. There we go. And I can give it a blur. Let's hit OK. And here you can see it shows up under my smart filters as a Gaussian blur as its own line item. So I can turn that Gaussian blur off or on at any time, which is really nice. And you can even double click right here on the name Gaussian blur or any filter you apply, and you can change that value at any time. And that's because it's a smart object. You can see our smart object icon here. If your layer is not a smart object, these filters would simply be applied to your layer and you wouldn't be able to change them later. So it's very helpful to use smart objects. Now, our Gaussian blur, we're not going to leave on here, so you can just click and just drag that right down to your little trash can icon, boop, and it'll just delete your Gaussian blur, and we'll just keep the camera raw on there for now, keeping in mind we can adjust those settings at any point in time. All right, so let's get into our coloring tools in Photoshop. We're starting with, in my opinion, the most versatile and powerful coloring tool in Photoshop, and that is the Hue Saturation Adjustment Layer. So let's go to our adjustment layers. It's right down here. It looks like a circle, half of it's light, half of it's dark. We'll just go ahead and click on that, and we're gonna go to Hue/Saturation. Okay, now let's just drag this out here. We'll do a quick little overview of the Hue Saturation Adjustment Layer, because it is, it's good to know there are several working parts in here that are just in general very helpful. Okay. So on the very top, you do have some presets. I don't tend to use these very often, but if you want to create your own preset, you can do that by hitting custom here. Right under that, you have what it says master, and by default, master is selected, and this means it's going to affect all of the colors in your image. So if I take my hue slider and go from right to left, you can see all of the hues or saturations or light values. It's all changing throughout my whole entire image. Now, if you get to a point where you don't like what you've done, you can just hit this reset icon right down there at the very bottom. Okay. You also have a little hand slider, which is kind of nice. You can click here, okay? And now you can see I'm adjusting the saturation of just the red. So this hand slider, let's just undo this. This hand slider will allow you to just choose somewhere in your image and start making adjustments. So I could choose these little leaves and start adjusting those. There we go. I could continue up here and adjust the hue of those as well. Ooh, art print. And you can see it's already chosen cyans from up there as well. So if you want to edit a specific part, that's one way to do it. You can also use this eyedropper here. So let's hit undo. If you want to use the eyedropper to fine tune your selection, first you want to go ahead and just choose the color. So let's just use reds. By default, this is going to select a pretty wide range of red. For instance, if I move the hue slider to the left or the right, you're going to see basically all of the reds in this image. Let's just turn this off and on. All of the reds in this image are shifting to a green color now. The reds in this tree in the background, for instance, okay? The reds over here. Now, what happens if you want to fine tune the reds that you actually want to change? What if you only want to change, these like really bright, vibrant reds that are on our subject's clothing, for instance? Well, now you can use these eyedroppers. Just go ahead and click on that eyedropper. I'm going to select that, and you can see it already minused some of the area out of that. Okay, so it's basically allowing me to select that. You can also hit the minus eyedropper and start to minus areas out if you want to do that as well. So it's just going to like shrink and shrink the area that it works on. Now, what it's doing is it's changing this little window right down here. So this hue slider on the very bottom, by default, if I just hit undo, you can see there's nothing there by default. First, what you want to do is go ahead and select your reds, okay? And then your hue slider will show up. So what this is telling us is the color on the top is going to be converted to the color on the bottom. So let's just drag this to the right. Okay, we're going to go all the way to the right here. And then we see that my reds have become green, and then here it's very clear as well. The reds have become green. But you can see we have a couple of different points here. We have our inner area, which is a little bit lighter in color, and then the outer area, which is a little bit darker. And this inner area is the area that is 100% going to get edited. This outer area is like a feathering out, okay? So it's just gonna fade out and not be visible there. Okay, now the cool thing is you can actually click right inside here. I'm just clicking in the very middle and just moving this to the right or left to see which area of my image gets affected. So this can be a very simple way of only affecting certain colors in your image. You can just move this to exactly where you want it and then make some changes. You can see now I'm affecting more of those reds in my subject's clothing, less in the background. Now, you can also go in here and click and drag to make these areas smaller. So if I just click and drag here, look at this, I'm making these areas smaller, and what that means, in essence, is that I'm affecting less of my image, okay? So you can do that with the plus and minus eyedroppers if you want to here. I actually find it a little bit more helpful to just use these sliders on the bottom, because just very easily, visually, you can go through and change those colors. Okay, so now I have about the area that I want to affect. In this case, I'm not going to bring my hue all the way up. You can still adjust your hue if you'd like to, but you can see now it's not adjusting the hue on the background colors or even this other color within my subject's clothing. It really is just targeting just those colors and allowing me to edit those, which is very helpful. So let's go ahead, we'll just bring this back down to 0 here, okay? And then we could do something like add a little bit more saturation. But let's just go ahead and undo this for now. We're just gonna get to the next feature, which is inside of the hue saturation adjustment layer. So just this one tool, there's a lot going on. The last feature is just, it's colorized. It's relatively simple, but it's basically just gonna color your entire image however you decide. So if you're trying to do any matching of color where you want to just say like, hey, this area, I want to be exactly this color, you can do that with colorize. So here you can choose your hue, saturation, and luminance. There we go. So I can just choose that point there, kind of bring this in. Now at this point, it's literally just going to color your entire image that color. So if you didn't want your entire image that color, what you would want to do is paint on your layer mask. So as you can see, by default, it comes with a white layer mask. That's going to mean that the entire layer is visible. If I click on my layer mask and hit Control or Command I, that just inverts my layer mask. So now it's completely invisible. Okay. And then I could just paint this visible just over top of a certain part of my image, for instance. Okay. So I could, similar to how we used masking, like with the adjustment brush in Lightroom, basically just using the same idea here. So if I wanted to, you know, just this piece of fabric to be this green color, there we go. You can do that. It's a little bit more of a manual process just because you're masking it in. But the nice thing about Colorize is you can really just like completely convert it to whatever color you want. All right, let's get this a little bit cleaned up here, and then we're gonna go back into our settings and take a look at making some changes there. All right. There we go. We'll just call this good because we're not going to wind up leaving this visible. Okay, so let's go back here and we can see now with our colorize function enabled, I can literally just change this to whatever color I want. If I want it to be a blue that kind of matches, you know, this blue down here, there we go. I just lower the saturation, you know, find the right hue there, lower the luminance, and like now that matches that pretty well. So it's a really great way to do that. The only real downside with Colorize is that it treats shadows, midtones, and highlights the same way. And that's not really how color works in general. Like, for instance, shadows and highlights tend to be less saturated, and midtones tend to be a little bit more saturated. So with this colorize function, if you're gonna do someone's skin or something like that, it can make it look very flat. And you'll probably see that if I just hold Shift and click on this, like, let's just bring the luminance or the light back to 0. You can see it doesn't look like this person's skin was painted with blue, right? And the reason is because the same saturation exists on the shadows, midtones, and highlights. It doesn't look very natural. So I would recommend using it sparingly, but if you do need a certain area of your picture to just like be a certain color, this is a good way to do it. Well, that's a general overview of this tool. Honestly, if you just learned this tool in Photoshop when it comes to color, you'd be pretty much good to go. So let's go ahead and, it's very powerful. Let's go ahead and just, I'm gonna clear everything. I'm gonna click on my layer mask. I'm gonna go to Edit and down to Fill. And we're just gonna fill this with white. Let me just grab my fill dialog. There we go. We'll just choose white. There we go. Now everything's gonna be visible. So how are we actually gonna use this? Well, let's start off here with, I'm gonna go to my greens. I'm gonna use my eyedropper to target the greens that I actually want to edit. Don't forget, you can always fine tune that here. Okay. Let's bring our saturation up a little bit, and we're gonna bring our hue back to the left a little bit. Make those plants just look a little bit more vibrant and saturated, and add a little bit of a yellow hue to them as well. All right, that's looking really good. Now with the same exact tool, you don't even have to create a new one. You can just now go to your reds. We'll use the eyedropper to focus in on our reds. And I'm just gonna bring the saturation of my reds up, and I'm gonna adjust the hue very subtly there as well. So you can see one adjustment layer used properly, we're able to really get a nice positive change in our photo. Let's go ahead and put that back where it belongs. So this tool is incredibly powerful. Don't feel pressure to use all of it, but if you want to target certain areas throughout your photos and change those colors, HueSaturation, you really can't do much better than that. So the next tool I want to show you is called Selective Color. And this tool is really great for making subtle changes to color. HueSaturation is super powerful, but you can make like very large changes. And in some cases that's totally okay. Like if you want to change the color of a car or something like that from green to red, a big shift is a good idea. But in a lot of cases, you actually want that to be a lot more subtle, especially when it comes to skin. So the selective color adjustment layer is very good because it allows you to be a lot more subtle, basically. So let's go ahead and grab our adjustment layer icon right down here. Go ahead and click there, and we're gonna go down to selective color. It's way down at the bottom. And we'll just drag this right out there as well. So selective color, relatively similar in terms of how you're gonna work with it to HueSaturation. You're gonna start off at the top and then just choose your color. So we'll just go to reds. And now you can see I've got cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And here's where I can just start changing subtle colors. So in this case, I'm adding more cyan or taking away cyan from my reds. But you can see if I just go like very far with either of these sliders, it actually doesn't make that big of a change. So if you're wanting to do fine tuning, this is a great place to do it. And in my opinion, it's also just very easy to use and intuitive. Yeah, I think like a little bit more yellow with those reds actually looks really good. You can take blacks out, which will lighten colors, or you can add blacks, which will darken colors. There we go. Generally, I'll leave the blacks at 0. Okay, well, that looks pretty good. Let's just turn our little preview off and on, and we can see we've brought those reds just a little bit more on the orange side, and I think overall it looks really good. But you can see like the skin tone still looks natural. This is a really great place for fine-tune adjustments. Let's do the same thing. I'm gonna go to my blues, all right? And there we go. And again, this is gonna affect, you know, your entire image here, but as always, if you want to use a layer mask, you can definitely do that. So, you know, making this visible and invisible. If I use my layer mask and only paint white over this bag, for instance, then that's the only place that becomes visible. All right, now let's go into our greens here and start pushing sliders. I think anywhere where you're in Photoshop or Lightroom and you just have a couple sliders to work with, I think that's just like so intuitive for me. Usually that's like, I'm able to just like put it over here, nope, put it over here, yep, you know, like it's not very technical, I know, but it's color and color is subjective anyway. I think this is looking really good. So we can see the selective color, turning this off and on, we were really able to get in and fine tune those colors, and I like what we're working with a little bit more. So let's go ahead and just turn all this stuff off. Turn our smart filters off there as well. This is a stock photograph, and the photograph was probably processed a little bit before I got to it, but you can see how powerful these tools are. So that's the Adobe Camera Raw filter to start off with, you know, very similar to Lightroom. Our HueSaturation really helped out with those colors, just like kind of, that's like your coarse adjustments, and then your selective color brought in those fine adjustments, and I think we're looking really good. We're looking great. There are 2 more tools that I want to show you how to use. One of them is just using your blending modes to affect color, and the other has to do with selections and layer masks. So let's get into our blending modes first. Now, to start with, if I want to just create a new layer on top of everything, I'm just going to choose a color here. We'll just choose a blue color. There we go. And I'm going to hit B for my brush tool to paint with my brush tool. And we're just going to go ahead and paint over. We'll just use the same piece of fabric that we used before. Why not, right? Here we go. So I'm just literally painting over top of this with my brush tool. Now, the nice thing about this technique is that I can choose the exact blue that I want to use. Okay, so if someone gives me like a hex code or something like that, or an RGB value or a Pantone or something like that, I can then paint in a specific area with that exact hex code. Okay, very, very easy to do. I'll just show you how to punch in hex codes in just a second. You just go to your little color picker here, and then down here at the bottom, you could just type in a hex code. And so if you were to use like adobe.color.com, you know, which can give you color palettes, you can just type in the hex code there. All that to say, you can just set that up for an exact color if you want to, and then in the blending mode of your layer, you can just change that from normal to color. Okay, and there you can see it's going to just make it exactly that color. Again, the color blend mode does include saturation. Okay, so it's going to be exactly as saturated as I tell it to be. And here you can see in some parts it works okay, but here in the shadow areas, okay, that doesn't look right, right? Like We talked about earlier how shadows and highlights tend to be less saturated and midtones tend to be more saturated. So here you can see we have some shadow areas that's not very saturated, right? It's kind of like gray. But if I just throw a color adjustment on it, it all of a sudden it becomes very saturated. So this doesn't look that good. So what I would suggest using most of the time is hue instead. So hue will take like the actual hue of the color, the blueness of it in this case, and apply it. But it's going to leave the saturation of my original image, and that's going to allow us for a much more realistic. You can see that cloth actually looks like real now. Now, don't forget on this individual layer, if I want to, earlier we went to image down to adjustments. Blah, blah, blah. All right, now don't forget on this layer, if I want to, I can actually use a hue saturation adjustment. All right, and that looks a lot more natural. Now the cool thing is I can actually use a hue saturation adjustment on this layer if I want to. So if you hit Control or Command U, there we go, it just popped up on my other screen, so let's go ahead and pull it over here. Control or Command U will allow me to adjust the hue of just the layer that I'm currently selected. So I could make it back red again. Hey, look at that, that's crazy. It's a lot of work for nothing, yay. No, but you get the idea. So you can run a hue saturation on your layers as well. So it's a little confusing because you have two different types of hue saturation. One is an adjustment layer. You can get to that by going to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and over to Hue/Saturation. Hit OK here. And see, that creates its own layer. By the way, when you click on this little icon right down here, that's the same exact thing as what we just did. It'll create its own hue saturation adjustment layer. But there's another way to do this. If you just go to Image, down to Adjustments, and over to Hue Saturation, this won't create its own layer. This will actually just edit the layer you're currently on. And you can see that in action here. Okay, so most of the time you want to use a hue saturation adjustment layer. But sometimes if you don't want to just adjust the hue or the saturation of the current layer, like in this case I just had that blue, that makes sense. You can also use other blending modes like soft light or overlay and can get some interesting effects there. In this case, it didn't really do exactly what I want. So let's hit Control or Command A to select all, and I'm gonna hit delete. There we go. And now what we're gonna do is I'm gonna hit G for our gradient tool. And I'm in my color picker, I'm just gonna choose like a bright yellow. And then we'll just choose a radial gradient. This is gonna be my foreground color to transparent. Okay, so I'm just gonna like, boop, do like that. Let's just put this back to normal here. So this is just what that gradient looks like. All right, let's just do it again so you can see in normal blend mode. So just click and drag out like that. And oh, beautiful. This is what that gradient looks like. Okay, now, if you want this color, right now it just looks like someone just took some yellow and put it over top the image. If you want it to blend with your image a little bit better, you can use blend mode. So I'm gonna change this from normal to something like soft light, and then, oh, looks like we got some light shining through there, right? You can even do other stuff with this too, like if you wanted to grab your brush tool, paint over your subject a little bit. There we go. Change this one from normal to soft light, okay? But then you're like, oh, I want it to be a little more blurred. Cool. Go to Filter, Blur, and Gaussian Blur. There we go. Fantastic. And if you're like, that looks good, but it's a little too saturated, then you can hit Control or Command U, which is the same thing as going to Image, Adjustments, and Hue/Saturation. This variation will adjust on my exact layer. I could bring my lightness up a little bit if I want. I could bring my saturation down a little bit. I can even adjust my hue while I'm in here and still get the little bit of color that kind of like, you know, it's kind of like just adding a little bit of brightness to my subject, but it's adding a little bit of warmth in terms of the color at the same time. Okay, so it's doing a little bit of both. You can adjust your opacity there. I recommend just turning these off and on to see what you're doing. So there you can see pretty nice effects you can just have and literally just like use the gradient tool or paint it over an area and then use blending modes. So you don't have to use advanced tools like hue saturation or selective color to make these types of changes. I just want to make sure that you know that you can just use a brush tool and then basically have it affect your image however you want. So we're almost done in Photoshop. The last tool I want to show you is select color range. So let's go ahead and zoom into our subject. Now we're going to go up here to select and then down here to color range, because this is very, very powerful. It allows you to simply click on any of your area, any part of your image, and make that into a selection. Now, up here at the top, you're going to see a fuzziness slider. Okay, there we go. And your fuzziness is basically how much or how little gets affected by wherever you click. Down here at the bottom, by the way, if your image looks different from mine, your selection preview might be on none. I like this grayscale because it just allows me to see what I'm doing, but you can also choose a few different options here, like a quick mask. This grayscale is kind of nice. Basically, if I click my eyedropper around, it's going to select the similar colors. So if I wanted to basically select the leaves, because they're all relatively similar, I can do that very easily. Or if I want to select like the red in my subject's clothing, I can say, ooh, let's extend that a little bit so it's more selected, or like, let's fine tune that. We can do that as well. Okay. Now this is very powerful. Let's just hit OK. The light areas become selected, by the way. Hit OK. So this is super powerful because I just use that tool to select the reds. So now I can do a lot with this result. For instance, I could just fill this color with, fill this layer with blue. So I could just, grab my, there we go. Let's just create a new layer. I'm gonna hit Shift Delete to bring up my fill dialog, and I'm just gonna say, fill it with my foreground color. Boom, filled it with blue. And then I'm gonna say, change my layer blend mode from normal to hue, and then hide my selection. And it's like, okay, that's pretty cool. Just changed all that pretty interestingly. Or let's just hit undo a couple times. There we go. Fantastic. So my selection is still active, but let's say I want to just load a hue saturation adjustment layer. Because my selection is already active, all I have to do is go to my adjustment layer, boop, down here, just go down to hue/saturation, boop, and check this out. My selection automatically loaded into my layer mask. So if I hold Alt or Option, that's now the layer mask of my layer. And then from here, I could go through and just adjust things if I wanted. So I can make some more changes to my reds if I wanted, get even more saturated and kind of dial those in a little bit. So this can be really helpful if you want to adjust like reds in your image, but like only a certain area of reds. Like, for instance, I'm going to hold Alt or Option and click on my layer mask. So you can see all these reds are getting affected, but then I can just hit B for my brush tool and then paint black on my layer mask and be like, okay, I don't want that in there. I don't want this in there. I don't want, I don't want to affect that thing. I don't want to affect that down there. This, I don't want to draw more attention to that. Keep it nice and simple. Okay, just that's what I want to affect. And then now I just hold Alt or Option, go back to my regular view, and I can turn this off and on. You can see those are the only colors. It's not a crazy adjustment, but that becomes the only colors in that area that gets affected by this adjustment. So it's super helpful to know. I realize these are a lot of terms and they're kind of like all a little bit separated, but you can actually use all of these together. So the whole idea here is we do have very powerful tools like hue saturation and selective color that can get you most of the way there. But if you ever want to adjust like specific colors in specific areas of your image, that's when layer masks are gonna really help out. And if you want to just do some experimentation or choose an exact color, like enter in a hex code, that's when I would suggest using like your brush tool or a fill tool or a solid color fill layer, and then change your blend mode to something like hue, and it'll just make that hue apply to that area. So if you're working with a brand or something, and they say, this is our brand's special green, and we want it to match perfectly this to our logo, you can just say, okay, send me the exact green you want. You could fill that green in Photoshop, change the, blend mode to hue, and then all of a sudden someone's shirt, maybe it's a blue shirt, you could change it to the exact green that matched the company's logo, and it would, it's just a good way to do it. people want that stuff all the time. So a lot of power here. I love Photoshop for all these tools. We've got another great section coming up for you next. We're gonna be using a lot of these similar tools. I just wanna show you multiple examples so you become a bit more comfortable. Alrighty, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next section. Bye everyone. Just my hair's a little bit extra spot, Coney boy.